My family wanted me to plan my vacation around my sister and her kids, and they were furious when I booked my flight anyway. My name is Scarlett Johansson. I'm 36, single, and a content director for a boutique travel agency in Portland. If you met me at a networking event, you'd probably hear about our latest campaign or a cultural series I pitched featuring hidden temples in Southeast Asia. What you wouldn't hear about is how exhausted I'd become, pretending that everything in my life was balanced, especially when it came to my family. They loved that I had a flexible life, a cool job, and no real obligations, which was their polite way of saying that I didn't have kids, and therefore, my time didn't matter. My older sister, Isabel, had 2 children under 10, a chaotic divorce pending, and a chaotic household to match, to my parents. She was brave and selfless, while I was conveniently available, always adjusting, never demanding. 3 years ago, I started keeping a folder on my desktop named Someday Japan. It wasn't for work. It was mine. Inside were links to traditional ryokan inns, hand-drawn walking maps of Kyoto's temple trails, and a clipped photo of a moss garden I'd read about in a travel magazine when I was 14. I'd waited years for the right time to go. After back-to-back years of 60-hour work weeks, client launches, late-night approvals, and a health scare that left my doctor concerned about my stress levels, I finally scheduled 2 weeks off. It felt like staking a flag on my own timeline. I even booked a private calligraphy workshop and planned a sunrise hike up Fushimi Inari. It wasn't just a vacation. It was a retreat from a life that had slowly closed in around me. I remember the night I told my family. It was a Sunday dinner, the kind we had at my parents' house twice a month, usually revolving around whatever Isabel's kids were going through. That night, I brought a bottle of sake from a local Japanese shop and printed out a map of my planned route across Kyoto and Nara. My mom looked interested, though distracted. My dad nodded, barely glancing up from helping my niece cut her food. Isabel didn't say much at all. She just raised her eyebrows slightly when I mentioned I'd already paid deposits and submitted my PTO at work. I remember feeling nervous, like I'd stolen a spotlight I wasn't entitled to. 3 days later, Isabel posted a group announcement in our family chat, surprise family trip to the Cascade Resort in Leavenworth. Booked it for the first 2 weeks of June. Finally, a real vacation for the kids. I stared at the dates. They were the exact same 2 weeks I'd just carved out of my life, within an hour. My mom called. "You'll be there." Right. It's the first real trip we've done all together since the kids were born. Isabel really wants everyone to be there. She didn't mention my Japan plans, even though she'd smiled and nodded through them days earlier. I reminded her gently, "I've already booked everything for Japan. I've been planning it for 2 years." There was a pause, followed by the soft sigh I'd come to know too well. "I know, sweetheart. But Japan will always be there. The kids won't be this young forever." That was the moment the old script began playing again. The one where I was the flexible one, the reliable one, the one who didn't have kids. So surely I could adapt. At work, I was known for boundaries, for making tough calls and sticking to deadlines. But in my family, I'd spent my entire adult life yielding to other people's expectations, trying not to cause friction, even when it cost me things I quietly resented giving up. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and reread every page of my Japan folder, the ink scroll workshop, the meditation retreat, the tea house reservation with a host who only accepted 1 visitor per day. These weren't just plans. They were promises I'd made to myself when I felt invisible in every other space. For once, I had chosen something for me. I wasn't willing to give that up, so I didn't explain again. I didn't offer to compromise. I simply replied to the family thread with 5 words that made everything explode. "I'll be in Kyoto then." The silence that followed was deafening. And it didn't last long. Less than an hour after I replied in the family group chat, Isabel messaged me privately. She opened with a smiley face, then jumped straight into what felt like a gentle push dressed up as concern. "I know you've had a lot on your plate, Scar, and I'm really glad you're taking a break. But maybe think about how much it would mean to the kids if you came. Leavenworth is so much easier for everyone. And honestly, it would be so good for you to be with family." I reread her words more than once. The way she said easier made it sound like my Japan trip was extravagant, maybe even selfish, while their plan was the noble, responsible one. The way she framed family togetherness felt like a quiet reminder of what I was expected to value most. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to feel where my boundaries had gone, because over the years, they'd been eroded by small, seemingly harmless expectations. The longer I stayed silent, the more the pressure spread. That night, my mom called close to 11 p.m., her voice calm and measured, with a tone I recognized from every moment I'd been nudged into compliance. "Scarlett, honey, Isabel is doing the best she can. Mark hasn't helped with the kids in months. They really need this. It would be healing for all of us to be together. Japan will still be there next year, but the kids won't be this age forever." The words were familiar, so familiar I could almost predict them. But what cut deepest was the way she never asked, never acknowledged that I had planned and paid for something that mattered to me. The next morning, my dad emailed me. He doesn't write often. But this time, he included scanned photos of our old family vacations, each labeled with the year in his neat, mechanical handwriting. The message was simple: tradition matters, memories last. We hope you'll reconsider. Your absence will be noticed. The phrasing wasn't cruel. It wasn't even direct. But it landed with the kind of emotional weight I'd learned to translate: don't disappoint us. Don't make a scene. Just be who we expect you to be. I didn't answer his email. Instead, the family messages started arriving in batches. My Aunt Patricia reminded me that family always comes first. As if it were a moral rule I was suddenly violating. A cousin I barely spoke to messaged a blurry photo of Isabel's kids, captioned already counting down the days I hadn't committed to joining them. But clearly, my attendance was presumed, or worse, considered optional enough to disregard, but expected enough to judge me if I didn't show. For days, I felt like a ghost in my own life. The Japan folder on my laptop sat open, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. The excitement I'd built for 2 years was being quietly disassembled by people who hadn't once asked me what this trip meant, or how long I'd waited to feel like I'd earned it. The conversation had never been about my burnout, the physical symptoms that had scared my doctor, or the nights I'd stayed up unable to breathe from the pressure of always being available. It was about Isabel's kids, her stress, my flexibility. At work, I finally broke the silence with Derek, my closest friend and colleague. We sat in a quiet conference room, surrounded by printouts for our fall campaign, the photos of mountain trails and city lights suddenly feeling distant. I told him everything: the timing, the guilt, the quiet unraveling of my boundaries. When I finished, he looked at me with that calm, clear look he always had when something important was taking shape. "They're not asking," he said. "They're expecting, and that's different." It was one sentence, but it reframed everything. He was right. My family wasn't making a request. They were asserting a default. That night, I opened my travel journal and made a list. Flights, lodgings, classes, experiences, a tea ceremony in Arashiyama, a hand-bound workshop at a tiny Kyoto bookstore, a guided temple walk by an architecture professor who only did one tour a week. I tallied the costs, over $5,000, including flights and deposits I couldn't recover. But even more than the money was the time I had spent convincing myself I was allowed to want this. The hours planning, saving, skipping dinners out, turning down social plans, saying no to new clothes, all because I had a vision for something that would give me peace. As the days passed, the family group chat remained active, but my name never appeared. Plans for Leavenworth were solidifying, rooms booked, matching t-shirts discussed, itineraries shared. I was no longer part of the conversation, and yet I was still the problem. My mother sent a single message one night that landed like a knife disguised as concern. "It's okay if you need time. We just wish you felt like you were part of this." I didn't respond. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply done giving up the things that made me feel alive so that others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I hadn't canceled my trip. I still hadn't changed a single booking. And deep down, I knew I wouldn't, because for the first time in a very long time, I was choosing to protect something, and that something was me. 2 weeks before my departure, I received an invitation that didn't look like an invitation. My mom called and said she was organizing a simple family dinner, something low-key, nothing big, just a chance to reconnect before summer schedules got hectic. Her voice was cheerful, almost forced, like she was selling a pitch she didn't believe in. I didn't ask questions. I just agreed to come. Even though I already sensed this wasn't going to be just dinner that Sunday evening, I pulled up to their house and immediately noticed the extra cars lined up along the street. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I hadn't seen in months, all gathered for what was clearly not spontaneous. As soon as I walked into the dining room, I realized it wasn't a meal. It was an intervention. Everyone was already seated. The air was heavy with a mix of expectation and false politeness. My mother stood first. "We're all here because we're concerned about the choices you're making," she said, her hands folded in front of her like a school principal. "This family vacation is important. Scarlett, we want you to be part of it. We need you to be part of it, one by one." The others chimed in. Aunt Patricia talked about generational bonds. My grandmother said she was worried about my mental health, because who in their right mind would choose temples in Japan over family memories? My father, usually reserved, finally spoke. "Scarlett, you've always been independent, but independence shouldn't become isolation. Family matters. Don't throw that away." And then came Isabel. She sat quietly at first, dabbing her napkin though we hadn't eaten yet, tears welling in her eyes in full view of everyone. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. "I just don't understand how you could do this to us. The kids ask about you every day. They're so excited for this trip. You're their only aunt. You mean so much to them, and now they think you don't care." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me. I knew that if I said one wrong word, the narrative would snap closed and seal me in as the villain. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I said nothing. I sat with the weight of their disappointment, let it wash over me, and didn't reach for a towel to dry it off. I nodded politely, thanked everyone for their concern, and told them I'd take time to reflect. Then I left. No fight, no tears, just silence. And in that silence, I felt something settle inside me. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was clear. The next day, I called Samantha, a former colleague who had left our agency 2 years ago after experiencing similar family pressure when she chose to move cross-country without her parents' blessing. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something that helped me name the pattern. That wasn't a dinner. Scarlett, that was a performance. And you were cast as the villain for refusing the script. It wasn't about Japan. It was about control. Her words rang true. My family hadn't just planned a trip. They'd planned a storyline, one where I'd inevitably cave and be welcomed back with praise for doing the right thing. When I broke the script, I became the problem to be fixed. Later that week, I brought the situation to Dr. Blythe, my therapist. I hadn't scheduled an appointment in months, but she made time. We sat in her quiet office with its warm lighting and the faint scent of lavender, and I told her everything, from the group dinner to the messages to the silence that followed. You're not just changing a plan, she said. You're threatening a family system that depends on you being flexible. That's why they're panicking. You're rewriting your role. We spent most of the session rehearsing responses, calm, clear statements that didn't apologize for my choice or attack theirs. Sentences like, I understand you're upset, but this is something I've committed to, and I love you, but I need space to make decisions without pressure. That night, I did something else I hadn't done in a long time. I opened a journal and started writing down every moment in the past 10 years where I had changed my plans to accommodate family needs. Graduations skipped, weekends given up, promotions delayed. The list filled 2 pages. I wasn't trying to keep score. I was trying to understand how quietly I had trained myself to disappear. That kind of erosion doesn't come all at once. It comes with small sacrifices dressed up as love, dressed up as duty. The next morning, I sat on my balcony with coffee in hand and watched the sky shift into soft gold. I reread what I had written. It didn't make me bitter. It made me aware. I had said yes so many times just to avoid disappointing others. But saying yes to them had meant saying no to myself, over and over, until I barely remembered what I actually wanted. Not this time. This time. I would keep my promise to myself, even if it meant being misunderstood, especially if it meant being misunderstood. In the final week before departure, the messages escalated from subtle to outright cruel. Isabel posted a long status on Facebook with a filtered photo of her kids wearing matching sweatshirts that read Disney Crew 2025, even though they were headed to a resort in Leavenworth. Not Disney. The caption read, "Some people choose family, some choose themselves. So proud of the family that shows up." It wasn't hard to see through the passive aggression. Comments from cousins and extended family followed quickly, each more pointed than the last. Some people forget who held them through college breakups. Wrote one, another said, "Children remember who was there and who wasn't. I wasn't tagged, but I was definitely being targeted." I didn't reply, didn't defend myself, didn't explain. I knew by now that this wasn't about the truth. It was about control. If they could make me feel small, ashamed, or guilty enough, I'd cancel everything and slide quietly back into my role. But I had outgrown it. Not dramatically, not in some burning, triumphant monologue, but gently, like skin that no longer fit. I just didn't say yes this time, And for them, that was the same as betrayal. The night before my flight, my mom left me a voicemail. Her voice cracked halfway through. "I hope you don't regret this. Scarlett, your father's blood pressure has been up since the dinner. He's worried sick. Isabel's had to tell the kids their aunt doesn't love them enough to come. You may think you're choosing peace, but this is breaking the family. I hope whatever you find in Japan is worth what you're leaving behind." I listened to it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to feel exactly how much weight I had carried for years. Their peace had come at the cost of mine, and I was finally done making that trade. That morning, I rolled my suitcase down the hallway of my apartment, each wheel click against the tiles reminding me I hadn't backed down. I had packed carefully, wrapping the small calligraphy brushes I'd ordered, the silk scarf I'd bought just for this trip, the guidebook I had dog-eared over months of planning. My flight was early. The sky was still gray when the Uber driver pulled up. The ride to the airport was quiet. I watched the streets blur past and tried not to rehearse conversations I wasn't going to have. At the check-in counter, I smiled at the attendant and handed over my passport. It was when she asked if I wanted my boarding pass printed or digital that I suddenly couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, chest burning, my vision tunneled in slow motion. I mumbled something and stepped away from the counter, gripping the handle of my suitcase like it could hold me steady. I made it to the nearest bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and felt the panic ripple through my spine like electricity. It wasn't loud. I didn't cry. My body just refused to breathe normally. After all the therapy, all the planning, all the resolve, it still hit me. Years of being conditioned to equate self-protection with selfishness don't just vanish. Choosing yourself isn't clean. It comes with flashbacks, doubt, muscle memory. Somewhere between the sobering words of my therapist and the silence from my mother, I had internalized the risk of being called difficult, selfish, broken. And now, in a gray bathroom stall, in the middle of an airport, it all came rushing back, until I heard a voice. "Honey, are you all right?" I didn't know who she was, just that her voice had warmth and age. When I finally stepped out, there was an older woman standing by the sinks, her silver hair tied back in a low bun, her hands folded gently in front of her. She didn't pry, just walked with me to a bench near the windows and sat beside me like we'd known each other longer than a minute. "I left my husband after 30 years, she said quietly. Took me a lifetime to realize I was allowed to choose peace. The guilt nearly broke me, but 3 years later, I can finally breathe again. I didn't ask her name. She didn't ask mine, but she steadied me. And when they called my boarding group, I stood up with clearer lungs. I thanked her. She smiled, then waved me toward the gate like a parent would, not possessively, but proudly. As I stepped into the jet bridge, I felt the weight start to lift, not all at once, but enough to move, enough to remind myself that I had not abandoned my family. I had simply returned to myself. The plane touched down just after sunrise, through the cabin window. The landscape looked calm and ceremonial, as if nothing here had ever been rushed. Kyoto was already awake, but not loud, its movement gentle and deliberate. When I stepped outside the airport and felt the early summer air brush my skin, it hit me harder than I expected. I was really here, alone, unapologetically. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had become background noise. The world had not collapsed because I chose to listen to myself for once. My first morning, I stood in front of Kinkakuji, the golden pavilion, as the reflection danced on the surface of the pond. Tourists took photos and laughed softly around me. But I wasn't trying to capture anything. I was trying to feel it, for the first time in months. My shoulders weren't tense. I wasn't waiting for a message. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was just still. The stillness felt foreign and holy. I wandered into back alleys lined with stone lanterns and wooden tea houses, then found a quiet seat in a small udon shop where no one knew my name. I ordered a simple bowl with tempura on the side and watched steam rise from the broth like a small ceremony. I didn't speak much Japanese, but the woman at the counter bowed slightly when she handed me the tray. I bowed back, and just like that, it felt okay to be unknown. Each day had its own rhythm. In the mornings, I journaled before breakfast, trying to stay present with my thoughts instead of replaying what I'd left behind. I took a calligraphy class with a teacher named Naoko who said very little but smiled when I tried too hard. "Breathe softer," she said, guiding my hand gently. "Ink reveals your tension." I didn't realize how much of me had been clenched until then. I walked the philosopher's path at sunset and let the stillness of the canal mirror my own attempt at quiet. In the evenings, I read poetry with my feet soaking in a hot spring. I didn't look at social media. I didn't check the family thread. I knew what I would find there, and I didn't need to be reminded of what I had refused to give. Instead, I filled my pages with what I was learning to receive. I wrote about the way the light shifted in the temple gardens, about the school children who giggled when they saw my chopstick struggle, about the man playing shamisen outside the train station, and the woman who placed a tissue in my hand when she saw my eyes were full. On the 5th day, I met someone. His name was Ethan, a photographer from Vancouver, traveling solo after a messy family year of his own. We met at a street stall in Gion, both reaching for the same yuzu-flavored shaved ice. We laughed, shared a bench, and traded stories slowly, like strangers unspooling yarn. There was no spark of romance. Not yet. Just a clean, respectful curiosity. He told me he hadn't spoken to his older brother in 9 months after being excluded from a family inheritance conversation. I told him about the Leavenworth intervention and the Facebook post. He didn't offer pity, just understanding. Sometimes that's all you need. We walked together through the bamboo forest the next morning. The light fell in vertical lines, golden and green, like the place had been designed by someone who understood the weight of silence. He took photos. I listened to the wind. We parted without exchanging numbers. Just a nod and a maybe we'll cross paths again. And I didn't feel the need to make it more than it was. Maybe growth is learning to let softness exist without clinging to it. By the end of the first week, I realized something had shifted. I no longer felt like I had to defend my choice. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had proven a point. I just felt settled. I stopped measuring the worth of my trip against what I might have preserved had I stayed behind. I stopped wondering if my absence had ruined their vacation. The truth is, if my presence could be so easily replaced with resentment, then it wasn't valued in the first place. And that knowledge, as painful as it once was, had turned into peace. On my final morning in Kyoto, I returned to the moss temple I'd dreamed of visiting for over a decade. I sat quietly on the edge of the wooden platform, looking out over the garden where every shade of green seemed to pulse with quiet life. A light rain began to fall, soft enough not to scatter anyone, just enough to make everything shimmer. I didn't take a photo. I didn't need to. Some moments are meant to live only in your body. I landed back in Portland on a Monday afternoon, the kind where the sky forgets to decide between cloud and sun. The air smelled damp and familiar, the kind of weather that usually meant routine was waiting. But something in me had shifted. I stepped off the plane carrying more than just souvenirs. In my bag were hand-bound journals, a small stone from the temple garden, and a silk scarf I hadn't yet worn. But the real weight was in how I walked slower, more deliberate, not from exhaustion, but from clarity. It's one thing to leave something behind. It's another to return knowing you've outgrown what's waiting. My apartment felt different, not smaller, not colder, just quieter than Kyoto. I unpacked slowly. Every item I placed back on a shelf was a negotiation with myself. What still felt like mine? What didn't? I didn't check my phone for hours. When I finally did, I saw the messages waiting, a text from Isabel, a single sentence. The kids were crushed. A Facebook post from my aunt showing a family photo with the caption, "Grateful for the ones who showed up." No direct attack. Just that old signature move, excluding me by pretending I was never part of it to begin with. There were no calls from my parents, no questions about whether I made it home safely, no apology, no curiosity, just silence, which somehow felt louder than if they'd yelled. I made tea and sat by my window, not waiting for anything to arrive. I was no longer checking their responses to measure my worth. I wasn't angry, but I also wasn't chasing resolution. That week, I returned to work and slipped back into projects with more ease than I expected. Derek noticed the difference first. "You look lighter," he said during a client brainstorm. "Kyoto must have agreed with you." I didn't explain the full story. I just smiled and said, "It reminded me who I was before I started apologizing for needing space." One evening, as I walked through my neighborhood, I passed the bookstore where I used to browse self-help titles, looking for answers to questions I never dared to ask out loud. I stopped at the display window. None of the titles called to me anymore. That night, I wrote in my journal without censoring. I didn't write about what had happened. I wrote about who I had become. The difference was subtle but real. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Heavy stock, gold lettering, no return address. I knew what it was before I opened it. My parents' wedding anniversary party. A formal dinner at an upscale venue downtown. Inside the envelope was a short note in my mother's handwriting. "Your presence would mean everything to us. Your absence would be noticed." It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a test. I placed it on my counter and didn't touch it for 2 days. When I finally picked it back up, I read it like a contract. I wasn't deciding whether or not to attend a party. I was deciding whether I was ready to walk back into a room where the rules had always been stacked against me. I brought the note to therapy. Dr. Blythe looked at me carefully, then said something that stuck. "If you go, go on your terms. Don't step back into the old version of you to make others feel comfortable. Let them meet the woman who came back from Japan standing taller." So I decided I would go, not to mend, not to please, but to show up in my own truth. I chose a navy dress I bought in Kyoto, simple, structured, elegant. It reminded me of the Moss Temple, of silence that didn't apologize. I didn't ask anyone for advice on what to say. I didn't prepare for arguments. I prepared for clarity. When I arrived at the venue, the atmosphere buzzed with small talk and crystal glasses. Isabel was the first to spot me. She looked surprised, then composed herself quickly. I nodded. She didn't smile. My father approached soon after, his hands in his pockets, as if unsure what to do with them. "You made it," he said. I nodded again. You look different, he added. I waited, wondering if there would be more, but he didn't continue. Not yet. Later, my mother pulled me aside, her voice lowered, controlled. We were hurt. Scarlett, you not coming to the trip. It felt personal. I looked at her and replied calmly. It was personal. Not against you. For me. For once. She didn't interrupt. There was no apology, but there was a pause, a silence that held weight instead of dismissal. I wasn't looking for redemption. I wasn't trying to fix them. I was just done shrinking to fit a version of myself that made other people more comfortable. The reception moved slowly, as if time had agreed to let tension take the lead. I stayed close to the edges of the room, not avoiding people, but not inserting myself either. There was music, polite laughter, the clinking of cutlery. No one said anything outright, but I knew the story that had been quietly passed around. Scarlett chose temples over family. Scarlett broke tradition. Scarlett disappointed everyone. But no one seemed to know what to do now that Scarlett had walked in without apology. The first person to truly meet my eyes was Emma, Isabel's daughter. She crossed the room without hesitation, her shoes too loud on the tile floor, and wrapped her arms around my waist. Did you bring me something from Japan? She asked with a hopeful smile. I told her yes, I did. I had picked out a small painted fan from Gyeon, wrapped it carefully, and brought it back just for her. Her face lit up, not because I had finally shown up, but because I had remembered her as her own person, not a pawn in anyone's drama. Later, as dessert trays began circulating, Isabel approached. She didn't smile, didn't perform. She simply stood in front of me and said, "Do you have 5 minutes?" We found an empty corner near the coat racks, behind a divider that gave us a bit of space without full privacy. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was ready for anything. I've been angry, she began, eyes locked on the floor, but not just at you, at everything. The mess with Mark, the kids acting out, Mom and Dad treating me like I'm supposed to be holding it all together. When you told us you were going to Japan, something in me just snapped. She looked up finally, voice steady but raw. It felt like you were abandoning us. And the truth is, I think I was jealous. You got to leave. You got to choose yourself. I haven't done that in years. I stood quietly, letting her words land where they needed to. I wasn't there to correct her, just to understand. She continued before I could speak. I know what we did wasn't fair. The messages, the dinner, all of it. We made you the problem, so we didn't have to look at the real problem, which is that we never gave you space to be your own person. Not really. I exhaled, not from relief, but from the kind of release that comes when someone finally tells the truth out loud. I told her I understood, that I never hated her for asking me to be there. I just couldn't keep disappearing to make everyone else feel whole. I missed being included, I added, but I missed myself more. She didn't cry, neither did I. We didn't hug, but there was a softening, a recognition that something had shifted between us. Not everything was healed, but something had been named, and naming it meant we could stop pretending it wasn't there. We returned to the main room and didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. But when I left, Isabel met me at the door and said, I hope next time you invite me to see the photos. I nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I believed that maybe next time wouldn't be just about guilt or duty. Maybe it could be about choice. The next morning, I woke up without the usual heaviness in my chest. I made coffee slowly, then opened my laptop and looked through the photo folder I'd left untouched since returning. Kyoto in morning fog, my calligraphy practice sheets. The path of Torii Gates I'd walked in complete silence. I clicked through them one by one and realized I hadn't taken these pictures to prove anything. They were never meant for Instagram. They were evidence for myself that I had followed through, that I had kept the promise I made quietly, in the middle of burnout and expectation and emotional noise, a promise to choose me, even when it cost me approval. Later that week, I mailed Emma's fan with a handwritten card. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be seen. I didn't need a response. I just wanted her to know that love wasn't about showing up on demand, sometimes. It was about showing up with your full self, even when others don't yet understand what that means. In the weeks that followed the anniversary party, the shift wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. My parents didn't suddenly become emotionally fluent or start validating everything I said. Isabel didn't turn into a champion of boundaries overnight. But there were changes in tone, in pauses that hadn't existed before, in the way conversations ended without guilt woven into the closing words. My mother called once and asked, "Is this a good time to talk?" I nearly dropped the phone. She'd never asked that before. It used to be assumed that I'd always be available. I told her I was busy, but would call back later, and when I did, she didn't mention the delay. She just asked how work was going, then listened all the way to the end of the story without redirecting to Isabel or the kids. It felt like learning a new language with someone who only spoke half of it. You couldn't expect fluency, but you noticed when they tried. My father even sent me a link to a travel article titled 10 Hidden Temples in Kyoto with a short note. Thought this reminded me of your trip. He didn't say he regretted what had happened. He didn't say he was proud. But the link was a crack in the wall. And sometimes cracks are how light gets in. Meanwhile, I began reconstructing the rhythm of my own life, this time without using family as the metronome. Tuesday nights became non-negotiable studio time. I started a watercolor class, something I'd wanted to try for years but always felt too impractical to prioritize. Saturday mornings, I walked to the farmer's market and bought vegetables I couldn't pronounce, not because I needed them, but because choice without permission had become a practice I wanted to keep. I muted the family group chat again. I told myself I would check it once a week, on Sundays, on my terms. That way, I could stay informed without being swept back into the current of performance. One evening, Derek invited me to an exhibit downtown, a small photography installation by a Canadian artist whose work captured stillness in motion images of open roads, abandoned chairs, teacups mid-pour. As I stood in front of one photo, a close-up of moss growing through cracks in stone, I felt that quiet reminder again. Growth isn't loud. It happens in the most unnoticed corners of your life. Derek turned to me at one point and said, "You know, you're not the same person you were before you left." I asked him what he meant. He paused, then said, "You're not performing anymore. You don't wait for permission to breathe." That night, I opened my Japan journal again. I hadn't written in it since returning. I thought the story was over, but something in me wanted to add the chapters that came after the moments that weren't captured in temples or train rides, but in conversations where I didn't fold, silences I didn't fill, boundaries I didn't justify. I wrote about the moment I declined a last-minute babysitting request from Isabel and offered to take the kids the following weekend instead. She had responded with, "Okay, thank you for offering. No passive aggression, no guilt, just, okay." It was small, but I knew it mattered. I also wrote about Ethan, about how he had reached out after we bumped into each other again this time, not in Kyoto, but at a bookstore in Seattle where he was showing some of his prints. We'd kept in loose contact, exchanged travel tips and books, but nothing had been defined, and somehow that made it feel more real. When we sat down for coffee that afternoon, he asked how I'd been, and I answered honestly. Not the polished version, the quiet one, the one that admitted some days still came with shadows, but I didn't fear them anymore. He nodded, and that was enough. We didn't talk about what we were. We talked about who we were becoming. By the end of the month, I had stopped needing to defend my choices to myself. I no longer repeated justifications in my head like courtroom arguments. I had chosen to take a trip because I needed it. I had chosen to say no because my yes had finally become something sacred. And when I said yes now, it came with presence, not resentment. The difference was everything. In early October, I surprised even myself by sending out an invitation. It wasn't formal, just a short message sent individually, not a group chat, not a chain email. I'm planning a weekend at the lake cabin. No expectations, just space to breathe. Bring what you want, leave when you need. You're welcome. I didn't organize games or meals or itineraries. I didn't try to make it look like the old trips we used to do, where everything was prepackaged under the illusion of joy. I wanted to create something slower, something real, and for the first time. I wasn't inviting people to perform family. I was inviting them to simply be. To my quiet relief, a few said yes. Isabel responded first. Can I bring board games for the kids? And maybe one night. Just the adults can sit by the fire. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. I told her that sounded good. My mom asked if she could bring a big pot of stew. I said yes, and also told her she didn't need to cook for everyone unless she wanted to. My dad didn't reply at first, but 2 days before the trip, he called and said he'd like to come for one night, just to see the leaves changing. That was all he said, but I heard what he didn't say, too. We arrived in small waves, not all at once. The cabin was quiet, surrounded by red and gold trees and the slow hush of water brushing against the dock. I brought extra blankets, a stack of books, and a playlist I'd built on the flight home from Kyoto. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about creating a space where no one had to fight for peace. On the second night, after the kids went to bed, we sat around the fire pit in wool socks and layers of old sweatshirts. No one reached for their phones. No one brought up old arguments. Isabel leaned back against the log bench and said softly, "This feels different." I nodded. It is. Later. My dad told a story I'd never heard before about a road trip he'd almost taken in his 20s, but canceled because of family obligations. I thought there'd be time later, he said. Turns out later becomes never pretty fast. He looked at me then. I'm glad you didn't wait like I did. My mother surprised me the most. As we washed dishes the next morning, she said, I've been thinking about trying that painting class you mentioned. I'm not good at it, but maybe I don't have to be. I didn't answer right away. I just handed her a towel and said, I'd love that. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It was subtle, but it felt like someone had finally stopped trying to make me into something convenient and started asking who I actually was. After the trip, things didn't become perfect. There were still awkward pauses, still old reflexes that showed up during holidays or scheduling conflicts. But there was more grace, too, more room. When Isabel asked me if I could take Emma to an afternoon dance recital while she handled Jake's soccer game, she followed up with, but only if you're free. I don't want to assume. I looked at the date and realized I was, so I said yes, not out of pressure, not out of guilt, just because I wanted to. Emma and I spent the afternoon eating popcorn in the school auditorium, whispering about how nervous the other girls looked backstage. Afterward, she hugged me tight and said, "Thanks for coming even though you were busy." I smiled and told her, this time, I wasn't. She didn't know how deep that sentence went, but I did. At work, I pitched a new campaign based on restorative travel, inspired by what Japan had given me. The client approved it immediately. My boss asked if I'd consider leading a series of sessions on emotional narrative building in content strategy. I said yes. And this time, I did it without fear of being seen as selfish for claiming space to lead. One night, as I walked through my neighborhood under the flicker of changing leaves, I thought about the version of myself who almost canceled that trip, the version who would have stayed, adjusted, accommodated, disappeared a little more just to keep the peace. I was glad I didn't, not because it gave me leverage, not because it earned me a lesson, but because I had finally stopped asking for permission to live a life that fit me. There was a calmness that settled in without announcement. It didn't come with applause or some final confrontation. It came on a Thursday morning while I was making coffee, standing barefoot in the quiet of my apartment, sunlight hitting the counter just right. My phone buzzed. It was a family group message I'd forgotten to leave. My sister had sent a few photos from their latest vacation, a beach rental somewhere pastel and warm, kids in matching outfits, captions soaked in curated harmony. I looked at the images, felt nothing sharp, and gently muted the chat, not from bitterness, not even from distance, just from choice. That, I realized, was the win. It wasn't about building something better than them or waiting for some moment where they'd call and say, "We were wrong." It wasn't about turning pain into power in some dramatic viral video way. It was about waking up one day and realizing their chaos no longer dictated my peace, and I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone who didn't try to understand in the first place. At the firm, I was leading 3 new accounts and mentoring a younger strategist who reminded me of myself, except more self-assured. She once asked me how I stayed so grounded, and I almost laughed. If only she had seen me a year ago, unraveling in parking lots, questioning every step, waiting for people to treat me kindly before I could treat myself with respect. I told her I learned the hard way that clarity only arrives when you stop negotiating your worth. That night, I sat with a blank page and tried to write something for myself, not a client, not a pitch, just something real. I wrote, "There will always be people who only see you through the version of you they built in their heads. But the people who matter will recognize you even when you rebuild." I folded the paper and tucked it into a book I'd been reading about boundaries. I didn't need to post it or share it. I just needed to know it was true. A few weeks later, Isabel reached out again. She said she wanted to visit the city with her daughter and asked if they could stay with me for a night, not because they needed a place to crash, but because Emma apparently had asked. "Can we go see Aunt Scarlett's cool apartment?" I paused, not because I doubted her motives, but because I was double-checking with myself. I asked, what version of me would be showing up to this visit? And when the answer came calm, curious, not contorting, I said yes. The weekend was quiet and kind. We walked around the botanical gardens. Emma asked about my plants. Isabel and I talked about our parents, but not from a place of blame, just from observation. She admitted she'd felt pressure to hold the family together because she believed I'd drifted. I told her I hadn't drifted. I'd just stepped out of a role I never chose. She nodded. We didn't cry. We didn't promise to fix everything. But we met as 2 adults, not two sisters stuck in the choreography of childhood. After they left, I sat by the window and thought about how long it had taken me to reach that one. Simple moment of being okay with who I'd become, even if no one else celebrated it out loud. It had cost me birthdays and holidays and all those awkward silences. But it had given me something better. It had given me myself. Weeks passed. My calendar was full, but not overwhelming. I traveled when I wanted. I said no when I needed. I returned messages not out of guilt, but because I wanted connection, not obligation. My mother sent me a text one evening, a photo of her holding a canvas she'd painted. It wasn't good, technically, but it was hers. She wrote, "You were right. I didn't need to be great, just honest." That was the first time she'd said those words to me. I replied, "It's beautiful," and I meant it. The truth is, I never got an apology for how they treated me when I said no to planning around their lives. I never got full acknowledgement. But I got something better. I got a new story, one where I wasn't the extra, the helper, the adjuster. One where I built the rhythm instead of being told how to dance. And maybe the real revenge was never about proving them wrong. Maybe it was about no longer needing their stage at all. So now, when people ask how I handled it, how I walked away from the pressure to always be the one who bends, I tell them this. There wasn't one big moment, just a series of small, steady choices to be honest, to be still, and to be mine. And if someone asked you to shrink yourself just to keep the peace, would you stay at their table, or would you build your own